Standing alone outside her aunt's house on a cold Christmas Eve, Julia Whitmore knew the frost on her boots was nothing compared to the chill she'd felt inside that home for years. To her family, she was still the reckless one, the black sheep who walked away from a safe, respectable analyst job to play entrepreneur. What they didn't see or refused to see was that Julia had become the CEO of Viridian Strategy Group, a rising force in renewable energy consulting across the Southwest. But none of that mattered around her relatives. In their eyes, she was still the one who didn't quite measure up. Her cousin Melissa, an MBA graduate from Northwestern who never missed a chance to boast, had once asked Julia if she was still freelancing. Her uncle Don, a longtime executive in the oil business, suggested she apply for an admin job, not realizing Viridian had just earned $3 million from one of the companies he admired. Julia had grown used to being talked down to, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt, especially when her own parents quietly agreed, never once asking about what she had built, never believing in her. The truth was, Julia never hid her success. She simply stopped offering it to people who didn't care to understand. But what they didn't realize, what they would soon learn, is that the woman they thought had failed was about to become the very person holding their future in her hands. For years, Julia Whitmore played the part her family expected of her, quiet, polite, and just eccentric enough to be dismissed. They called her the dreamer, a woman who'd walked away from a stable position at a prestigious consulting firm to chase what they considered a fantasy. But while they laughed behind closed doors and offered her job leads, she didn't need Julia was building something far more powerful than any of them could imagine. She launched Viridian Strategy Group with the kind of precision most people wouldn't associate with a so-called rebel. Her first office wasn't flashy. It was a modest co-working space in downtown Austin, one she intentionally kept up as a public front. It was a decoy. Behind the scenes, her actual headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a high-rise overlooking Lady Bird Lake, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows, custom art installations, and a team of elite strategists shaping the future of renewable energy across the Southwest. She didn't hide her success out of shame. She concealed it out of strategy. She knew that in a family where legacy and appearances mattered more than innovation and outcomes, revealing too much too soon would only fuel their criticism. They didn't ask about her work, and she never offered. But her name under the pseudonym J.L. Phoenix was already making waves in industries her relatives barely understood. She'd negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions, restructured divisions at major corporations, and quietly acquired strategic leverage in companies that were still trading on outdated oil models. Even her own parents believed she was struggling sending her job listings and offering advice about playing it safe. They never knew she had out-earned everyone in the family, combined by the time she turned 34. They never asked about her business, never visited her offices, and certainly never suspected that the very company they were trying to merge with the mysterious Aurora Grid Inc. was Julia's own shell corporation, designed to orchestrate a hostile restructuring of their failing legacy firm. The misjudgment wasn't just occasional, it was constant. When she came home for holidays, she endured comments about finding real work or jokes about startup life. Her cousin Melissa flaunted her promotion to head of strategic growth at Whitmore Energy, the family's oil company, as if it were a divine right. Her fiancé Cameron, a junior executive at the same firm, once smugly offered to put in a good word for Julia. She smiled and nodded, all while knowing that Viridian had quietly purchased millions of dollars in Whitmore's corporate debt. Julia didn't need to be seen. She needed to win, and winning for her wasn't about applause. It was about leverage. Operating under the radar, allowed her to build Viridian without interference, without politics, and most importantly, without the weight of family expectations. Every contract signed, every client gained, every strategic acquisition made, each one was another brick in the empire she was building. And when the time came to reveal who she truly was, she wouldn't just have a seat at the table. She would own the table, the boardroom, and the future of the company that once looked down on her. Julia Whitmore didn't hide her success because she lacked confidence. She hid it because she was playing a longer, smarter game. And soon, the people who had underestimated her for years would come face to face with the CEO they never saw coming. The house was warm with the glow of Christmas lights, but Julia Whitmore had never felt more like an outsider. It was Christmas Eve, and her aunt's home in the suburbs of Austin was alive with catered hors d'oeuvres, clinking glasses, and the buzz of oil executives chatting about market trends. But for Julia, it was just another night of enduring polite insults from a family that refused to acknowledge who she really was. As she stepped inside, her aunt greeted her with a quick hug and a quiet warning. Just don't mention your little business tonight, okay? Your Uncle Don's here with some investors. Julia gave a small nod, hiding her frustration behind a tight smile. Little business, she repeated in her mind. They still had no idea. She moved through the room carefully, avoiding the spotlight, though all eyes were already on Melissa, her cousin who had just been promoted at Whitmore Energy, the family's legacy oil company. Melissa was proudly showing off her engagement ring while her fiancé Cameron, a smug junior VP, soaked in the attention. Julia barely made it past the kitchen before her uncle waved her over. "Took you long enough," he said, slurring slightly from the bourbon. "Come meet Glenn Martin from Velocity Core. They're hiring data entry." He laughed, thinking it was a generous offer. What he didn't know was that Velocity Core was one of Julia's clients and that her firm, Viridian Strategy Group, was overseeing their $120 million shift into renewable assets. Before she could respond, her Uncle Don burst into the conversation, loud and confident as ever. "These merger talks with Aurora Grid are killing me," he said to the investors, not knowing that Aurora Grid was a shell corporation Julia had created to force Whitmore Energy into a deal she controlled. "If we could just get a meeting with Viridian Strategy Partners, maybe we could move this along," Don grumbled. "They don't take meetings," one of the board members added. Julia took a slow sip of her cider, biting back a smile. They didn't know the CEO they were chasing was standing right there. "Maybe they're not impressed by the Whitmore name anymore," she said too softly for most to hear, but loud enough for Don to catch. The entire room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Her uncle's face flushed crimson. "What would you possibly know about our business?" he barked. Her father rushed in, gripping her elbow and pulling her into the kitchen. His voice dropped into a harsh whisper. "Are you trying to humiliate me? You've embarrassed us in front of the board. This reckless streak of yours, it's not cute anymore." Then came Melissa, arms folded, leaning against the doorframe with Cameron right behind her. Maybe she should leave, Melissa said, smug as ever. "This merger is too important to risk more drama." "She's right," Julia's father said coldly. "Get out. We don't need some low-level consultant spreading rumors." Julia looked at all of them, her father's disappointment, Melissa's arrogance, her mother's silence in the corner, and she made her decision. "Fine," she said quietly, reaching for her coat. "But remember this moment. Tomorrow will be enlightening." Cameron snorted. "What could you possibly do?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The signed merger documents sitting on her desk back at Viridian already had everything they needed to find out. And when they did, they would realize they hadn't just pushed her out of dinner. They had handed her the keys to their company without ever knowing it. As she stepped back into the cold night, Julia didn't feel anger. She felt clarity. For years, she'd hidden her power out of respect. But tonight, they made it clear they'd never respected her in return. That was about to change. The boardroom was still and silent, far too quiet for a meeting of this scale. But Julia Whitmore had orchestrated every detail of the morning, down to the second. At precisely 10:00 a.m., just as planned, the frosted glass doors to her executive suite swung open. 8 figures stepped inside her Uncle Don, red-faced and pacing. 4 senior board members of Whitmore Energy, their interim CEO, her father stern and uneasy, Melissa freshly promoted to head of strategic growth, and her fiancé Cameron trying too hard to appear confident. They thought they were meeting the elusive J.L. Phoenix, the mysterious CEO of Viridian Strategy Group, the one person standing between their family-run oil business and financial collapse. Julia didn't keep them waiting long. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her lipstick, and calmly walked to the head of the table. "You're here," she said, her voice clear and even, "to meet with Viridian's CEO. That would be me, Julia Whitmore, also known as J.L. Phoenix." The moment hit like thunder. Her uncle's jaw dropped. Melissa's smug expression turned to disbelief. Her father sat frozen, eyes narrowed as if trying to process the impossible. "She's bluffing," Melissa hissed. "Sit down," Julia said evenly. And to everyone's shock, Melissa obeyed. Julia nodded to her assistant, who distributed thick merger packages across the table. Inside were detailed financial analyses, confidential performance reports, and the hard truth: Whitmore Energy was drowning its reserves, depleted, its market share evaporating. "You're 6 months from collapse." Julia began clicking a remote that illuminated the wall with charts and graphs. "Your efforts to modernize have failed. Your leadership has burned through capital without return, and Viridian owns the debt you've been using to survive through shell-holding companies you never bothered to trace." Her words sliced through the silence. The air shifted. The smugness drained from Don's face. Cameron looked lost. Melissa's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. And Aurora grid, her uncle asked, his voice gravelly. "My company," Julia replied, "a shell I built to bring you here to this exact moment. Every deadline you missed, every clause in your contracts, you were playing against me." "Why would you do this?" her father finally asked, voice cracking. Julia looked him square in the eye. "Because you never believed I belonged here. And last night you kicked me out for speaking the truth. But today you'll listen." Then came her terms. Immediate board resignation, a full restructure, all future leadership roles to be earned, not inherited. Melissa and Cameron removed. Nepotism was over. "You can't do this," Melissa cried. "Dad, stop her." But Don didn't move. He couldn't. He saw the writing on the wall, and it was signed by his niece, the woman they'd dismissed, mocked, ignored. Now she held their future in her hands. One by one, they signed the documents. Julia watched without satisfaction. This wasn't revenge, it was reality. She had spent years quietly building an empire while they were too busy gossiping at holiday dinners. Now she wasn't just part of the family business, she was the business. As they left the room in stunned silence, her father lingered. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "You were." The door closed behind them, and Julia turned to face the skyline through the tall windows of her office. Her world, her rules. And for the first time, they finally saw her, not as a dreamer, but as the architect of their salvation. The conference room was still echoing with tension as the final signature hit the dotted line. Julia Whitmore, now fully unmasked as J.L. Phoenix leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady, her voice calm, and her power unmistakable. Every person at that table, her Uncle Don, her cousin Melissa, Her father had spent years doubting her, but now the fate of Whitmore Energy, the family's crumbling oil empire, rested entirely in her hands. It wasn't just a merger, it was a complete takeover, and it wasn't accidental. Julia had designed this moment like an architect builds a tower, deliberate, calculated, with every piece falling into place over years. She had created Aurora Grid, a shell company disguised as a rising international player, for one purpose: to lure Whitmore Energy into a deal they thought they were controlling. In truth, they had been negotiating with her all along. They just didn't know it. Now, under her terms, the board would resign immediately. All executive leadership would be replaced, starting with her cousin Melissa and her fiancé Cameron. No more favors. No more hand-me-down promotions. If you wanted a seat at Julia's table now, you'd have to earn it. You can't do this, Melissa had cried, tears streaking her foundation. Dad make her stop, but Uncle Don had nothing left. His bluster was gone, replaced by the quiet dread of someone who finally understood he had been thoroughly outplayed. Even Julia's father, once so quick to call her reckless, sat slumped in his chair, stunned into silence. His daughter hadn't just made it. She had surpassed them all. As they filed out of the room, contracts signed, Julia remained seated. Her assistant, Emma, stepped in and handed her a glass of champagne. "Congratulations," she said gently. Julia gave a faint smile but didn't raise the glass. Not yet. There was no victory dance. This wasn't about revenge. It was about resolution. Years of being dismissed, laughed at, excluded from decisions, told to sit down and be quiet. Now those voices had no choice but to listen. The media explosion came fast. Headlines like, "CEO behind energy merger, is Whitmore black sheep, and JL Phoenix unmasked." The billion-dollar woman no one saw coming flooded the business news cycle. For the first time, the public saw what Julia had built, but more importantly, her family finally did. Back at the office, Emma read the updates aloud. Uncle Don was stepping down, attempting to sue, but crushed under evidence of mismanagement. Julia's legal team had prepared for this. Melissa and Cameron had taken to social media calling her power grab personal and cruel. But journalists were quick to highlight their nepotism, poor decision-making, and the company's years of slow decline under their leadership. Her father retired early, unable to stomach reporting to his daughter. Julia never gloated. She simply moved forward. Viridian Strategy Group didn't slow down. With Julia fully in control, the Whitmore merger became a symbol of strategic transformation in the energy sector. Within months, the company's valuation began to climb again, this time on sustainable foundations. Julia led with data discipline and a firm but fair hand. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about building something that could actually last. And she had. That evening, she stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, watching the Austin skyline light up. It had taken her years to be heard. And now that she finally was, she had no intention of letting that power go to waste. She whispered softly into the quiet Merry Christmas. But it wasn't a toast to revenge. It was a declaration of arrival. The headlines were relentless. The secret CEO who outsmarted her family. Julia Whitmore from outcast to industry powerhouse. The story of how Julia, once dismissed as the black sheep of the Whitmore family, took control of their crumbling energy empire, had captivated the business world. But in the weeks that followed the dramatic takeover, it wasn't just the media that came calling. The fallout at home was far more personal. Her Uncle Don, after decades at the helm of Whitmore Energy, had resigned in disgrace. His attempt to sue Viridian Strategy Group was buried under a mountain of evidence, shady accounting, poor leadership decisions, and mismanagement that had pushed the company to the edge. His voice, once booming with authority at every family gathering, was now silent. Julia's father, who had once looked her in the eye and called her reckless, retired quietly. He couldn't bear the shame of reporting to his own daughter. Publicly, he claimed health concerns. Privately, Julia knew the truth. He couldn't reconcile the version of her he used to scold with the one who now commanded an empire. But the loudest fallout came from Melissa and Cameron. Her cousin took to social media painting Julia as heartless, vindictive, and obsessed with proving a point. Cameron followed suit, accusing her of destroying their careers out of spite. But the public wasn't buying it. Journalists quickly uncovered the web of nepotism that had protected Melissa for years. Analysts pointed to Cameron's costly strategic failures. The narrative flipped. Julia wasn't the villain. She was the savior, unapologetic, methodical, and right. And Julia said nothing. No interviews, no rebuttals. She let the truth speak for itself. Inside Viridian's glass and steel headquarters, Julia remained focused. Her days were filled with integration meetings, restructuring initiatives, and long hours spent cleaning up the mess her family had left behind. Under her leadership, Whitmore Energy began showing real signs of recovery. Contracts were renewed. Investor confidence surged. 6 months after the merger, the company's valuation had nearly doubled. But while the business was thriving, Julia kept her emotional walls high. She ignored the texts and voicemails from relatives trying to suddenly reconnect. She had nothing to prove to them anymore. Then one afternoon, her assistant Emma stepped into her office with a strange look. "Your mom's downstairs," she said quietly. "She wants to see you." Julia froze. Her mother hadn't reached out once since the takeover. Not when Julia was humiliated and kicked out of Christmas dinner. Not when the news broke. Not even when the entire family structure began to collapse under Julia's leadership. "Send her up," Julia said. A few minutes later, her mother stepped inside her presence, awkward in the sleek, modern space. She looked small in the oversized guest chair, twisting her hands in her lap. "This is quite an office," she said softly. "What do you want, Mom?" Her mother hesitated. "Your father's not well. The stress. It's been a lot." Melissa's engagement ended. Cameron left her after the demotion. The family's unraveling. Julia kept her voice measured. "That's unfortunate. But I made business decisions based on what was right, not what was comfortable." Her mother's eyes glistened. "We thought you were struggling all those years. We didn't understand." "No," Julia said quietly. "You didn't care to understand. When I bought my first firm, you offered me an admin job. When I made my first $1 million, you celebrated Melissa's promotion instead. We were trying to help. No, you were trying to shape me into something I never was." There was a long pause before her mother whispered, "Can we fix this?" "Whitmore Energy will be fixed," Julia replied. "The family, that's not my priority." As her mother stood to leave, Emma appeared to escort her out. Julia turned back toward the skyline, remembering something her grandmother once told her. Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. And finally, she had. 6 months after the takeover, Julia Whitmore had grown used to ignoring the flood of family messages. Some were furious. Others were filled with sudden praise or shallow nostalgia. She didn't answer any of them until one day a message stopped her cold. It was from Sophie Uncle Don's youngest daughter. The only one who had never mocked Julia, never joined in the whispers. "I don't want anything. I just wanted to say you inspired me. Watching you stand your ground gave me the courage to try. I'm starting something of my own." For the first time in months, Julia smiled. Not out of pride, but out of connection. Real, honest connection. She picked up the phone and called her assistant. "Schedule a lunch with Sophie," she said. "Family?" Emma asked. No, Julia replied. An investor meeting for someone with real potential. Sometimes the people you expect to support you will be the last to see your worth. But don't let their blindness dim your light. Keep building, keep showing up. The right people, those with open hearts and open minds, will see you. And when they do, you won't just change your life. You might just inspire someone else to change theirs too. If this story touched you, leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone close? How did you respond? Subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that remind us all quiet strength is still strength. And your moment, it's coming.